Hey, folks, welcome back to More Than a Refresh, the T3D sessions. Today we have Jordan Tigani of MotherDuck. He is co founder and CEO. Jordan, give us a little background and what are we talking about today?
Sure. Yeah, as you mentioned, I'm co-founder, CEO at MotherDuck, company I helped start just about 4 years ago now. Well, time really, uh,
Yes, it does.
time passes. Um,
Oh,
and I've
there was
been,
a time when this was not gray, right? I mean,
yeah,
it
exactly.
doesn't seem like it was that long ago.
And I had,
But I wasn't going
parents,
to bring that up.
like,
I wasn't going to bring that up.
running a startup helps, accelerate the aging process,
That it does.
pretty quickly. Um, But I've been a database guy for a long time. Helped start Google BigQuery. Led engineering and product at Single Store, and kind of took some of the things that I learned from there, and said, "Hey, there's a better way to do it using kind of this new, at the time, database called DuckDB. It's open source, and so partnered with the founders of DuckDB and started MotherDuck." And kind of the thing that I think might be interesting to talk about today would be um, the kind of the emerging abilities of AI and LLMs and agents to allow a broader category or cross section of people to be able to do analytics. I think typically, which has been sort of in the realm of people who knew how to write SQL, SQL analysts.
Mhm.
And there's, kind of self-service BI, self-service analytics has been something people wanted to do for a long time, so that people closer to the business could get their own answers. And and I think have been a bunch of attempts to do this in the past that have kind of been okay for demos, but not for sort of real world use cases. And that seems to be really starting to change and accelerating at an accelerating rate in the last few months, even.
You know, first, so I've been doing this a really long time. My company's been around since '97. I don't think that there's any argument that SQL analysts slash SQL developers would love for their bosses to be able to ask questions of data. But I pretty much, as someone who's been in the database world again for decades, the DBAs will hate it. So, uh, you mentioned LLMs. I mean, is the idea here to be able to say, hey, let's assume I'm sitting at a desk and I would like to know, I want to be able to say this or type this. I want to know the top sales over quarter per this customer market, right? And the LLM will just poof, write a query and in theory talk to the database and deliver the results. So is that what we're talking about here?
I think that's effectively what it is, and I think that's the way I had been thinking about it for a long time. Just as it's like, hey, you talk to the database, or talk to something, and then writes a SQL query, and the SQL query gives you the results back. And um, and that's hard to do. It's hard to sort of, because that requires you to, like, the LLM to essentially one shot. It's got to understand your data model. It's got to understand your data. It's got to understand, what a quarter means to you, or what your regions are. If you're kind of want to see, broken down by regions, maybe you have, like, you know, um, weird names for them, or like everybody's got sort of in their own data has, like, weird and broken and inconsistent stuff, that has been sort of why people have been saying, like, yeah, like, the LLMs are just not going to be good at this. Um, and that's true, but you throw agents into the mix, and I know agents are sort of those buzzwords that everybody's like, oh, agent this and agent that, but an agent can do effectively what a human would do. So if you had an analyst and you go to the analyst, if you ask that question of the analyst, um, they would go and they'd start writing a SQL query, and, like, let's say they were new on the job, and they would sort of poke at the tables, and they would see, like, which table do I think this should be, or what database, or like, and then they would look at the data and then they would say, hey, it looks like I should be able to join with this. Oh no, that looks like the wrong key, or like looks like that didn't quite work. And they kind of poke around and figure something out. And eventually they would get it right and they would double check it and it'd be like, that looks right. And they would, deliver to you the answers. And that's
Okay.
essentially what an agent can do.
Okay. And I want to challenge this idea a little bit. And I want to pull it out of the current buzzword compliance. And that's I'm not suggesting. I mean, your presentation is accurate, right? There are things it can do. It's supposed to help the things that can help a human do. But let's talk about Amazon for a second. I'm not talking about AWS. I'm talking about their in-present stores, not Whole Foods, but the whole Amazon Go. And I don't know if you're in Seattle, so you probably know what these are, right? The idea was you
The
walk into
shopping
the store,
rest,
you get, yeah, you
the
buy,
shopping
you,
grocery stores.
yeah, it's a grocery store. You go walk in, you get everything, and you just walk out, and it just magically does what it's supposed to do.
Yeah.
The problem is, it wasn't magic. It was slaves in India. Okay. So while, I mean, that's what it was. They were very low paying, dirt paying jobs that, you know, people in Western Europe and the United States and Canada would never do because they can't afford, right? It wouldn't pay the bills. So you have to go to a market where it would pay the bills and basically enrich our privilege. Okay. That's what happens. Now, I have no problem with that as a general rule because that's just the way economies work. But the the technical problem is the same. You're expecting a bot to be able to do what a human can. And while there are certain things that they are good at, like if I connect to Amazon, I can say, you know, show me my orders over X, and it'll do that. Or, I need help with Y. It can give me pointers, right? But it can't solve the problem.
Hmm.
How is an agent better, especially in consideration that, currently LLMs are just a pyramid scheme, right? There's no forward profit capability. I mean, maybe Google in the future because they're subsidizing it, right? But something like a Chat GPT or something like that, I the amount I mean, it's not just research. I've talked to a lot of people about this, and I apologize. I'm sure you weren't expecting this kind of conversation, but I mean, it's a challenge, right? I mean, these agents are good for certain things. I'm not arguing that, but they're not an end all be all, and they can't replace a human. And there's nowhere it's not in sight, not in our lifetime.
So, like, I think, there's a question of replacing humans, but I think there's also the question of like, can they do a good job? And I think there's existence proofs of that they can do a good job for these types of problems. And like, so we launched, you know, MotherDuck. We launched an MCP server, which kind of allows you to kind of using Claude or ChatGPT to connect Claude or ChatGPT to your database, and then Claude will poke at it and ask it questions and kind of drive the session. And so we turned our company loose on this, and like including our sales team. And it was super interesting what the sales team would ask. They would ask things like, I mean, they would say, okay, for this customer, what's their revenue? What's their usage look like? How have they been using the product?
Mhm.
And it'd be able to kind of like spit that out, the kind of things that an analyst um would do and would take a lot longer. I personally, you know, have been the person at my company that wrote the most SQL, that wrote the most number of queries, because I'd like to do a lot of ad hoc stuff, and I'd like to poke at like, okay, what's actually going on, or there was a drop here, or like and and since this technology came out, I've stopped doing that. I've just been asking Claude. I've been saying like, hey Claude, what's going on with this change that I'm seeing, or what's this customer up to? And it gives me a good answer. And yes, there are, hallucinations, and there are things that it gets wrong,
Sure,
but there are also things that a human, first of all, there are things that a human gets wrong. The other thing
sure.
is by having the the business user be the one that actually is doing this, they actually have a lot of context about what they expect the outcome to look like. And they're the ones that are actually really able to say, this looks off. And then they can poke at it and they can say, hey, Claude, what's going on here? Or, hey, Claude, try this a different way. Versus like as a, if they, an analyst, very often would just sort of like take, well, this is what the outcome said, and then have to go through a feedback process uh, with with the business user. Uh, and I was mentioning that kind of our sales force has been using this. Like, it's just interesting the kinds of questions they asked. Like, they're sort of the basic ones, like the kind of or the standard ones that you might ask a uh, to build a dashboard about. But some of them are just like, what customers should I talk to today? And
Okay.
those are some
S-
really interesting open-ended kinds of questions.
So this should have been on the longer format because I have a feeling you and I could have a deep and sometimes adversarial conversation about this. The First, let me say I use AI. Okay, I'm not suggesting that I'm a luddite and I'm not using tools. Of course, I use tools, and my preferred one is Gemini, just because it comes with Google Suite, and that's what we have, right? And Sam Altman looks like a sociopath. I'm sorry, he does. I mean, he just it doesn't. He scares me. My issue, look, tools are great, and I recognize that commerce must continue. I am a capitalist. I'm a for-profit guy. Um, but isn't there I mean, there has to be some level of concern on two fronts. One, Claude is developed by a company that stole everything. They're thieves. They've been busted. They've got a class action. They lost. Okay. Anthropic is not a public benefit corporation, no matter how much their sales team says it. How do I know this? I got the letter because they stole from me. Okay. So there's that. So there's definitely a question of ethics in terms of using something like Claude because you are supporting thieves. They're the tech mafia. Okay. There's that. Now, and really, let's be honest, ethics is always subjective based on how much money you're making. I don't care who you are. Someone steps up and says, here's X amount of dollars. There is a threshold where your ethics bend. Okay. That's human nature. I'm not blaming anybody. It's human nature. But my bigger concern is the second part you brought up, which, and we're going to go a little long here, is you said the salesperson would ask, what customer should I talk to today? What that says to me is you are not invested in your clients. You don't know your clients. You're not a salesperson. You're a customer service rep. That's a concern because good companies, their salespeople, they know their clients. They're not taking orders. They're not order entry. They know who their kids are. They know when birthdays are. These are the guys that are making the $1 million deals because they actually know their client. So doesn't it concern you that, to me, that's a red flag. If I was able to go to my stack and my agent and say, I want to know what salespeople are asking you that question, they're the first salespeople that would be under review.
So like we have a usage-based business, and our usage-based business is based on, what did people do today? Like our revenue is really like, what did people do today? How many queries did they run? Uh, and so customer usage can change, at the drop of a hat. Like
Sure.
sometimes there are these spikes, and sometimes there's drops, and sometimes even if you're on top of the customer and meeting with them frequently, and you know who their kids are, and like you know them deeply, like you can't always predict what the major swings in their usage is going to be. And so basically the question was relative to, like, this is what the sort of the changes in the usage, Have they changed the mix of usage? Does it look like they added a new use case? Does it look like they put a cache in front of the, what they were doing? Does it look like they hit a bunch of errors? Had they had some, support requests? That, just as a kind of an early warning sign, like who should I reach out to today? Because we also have a very land and expand business. And so we get people in, they start using the product, they like it, they use more of it, they find new use cases, but also, sometimes that takes, it doesn't sort of happen organically, or it doesn't happen as fast as you'd want it to organically. So part of the job of the sales team is to help help the customer explore new ideas, explore new workloads, explore the, you know, what are some adjacent teams that might have some workloads? What are some other things that you're doing that, might need, you might be able to use this, and brainstorm with them. But, I think one of the good ways of doing that is also just to keep an eye on how they've been using the product, and that's what this automation can help with.
Okay, so and we're gonna close with this. I think I need to be fair because based on what you just described, it's really no different than a dashboard, right? I clicked a button that said, "These are the top 10 clients who, usage decreased by, say, the most percentage," whatever the
Yeah.
percentage is, the most percentage, month-over-month or quarter-over-quarter. Therefore, I need to reach out with them and see what's going on and how their usage or needs or solutions may have changed. Uh, and with that, folks, that's been another More Than a Refresh, a slightly longer T3D session, but I think it was worth it. Jordan, thank you so much. You've been a gracious guest. I know I challenged a little bit. I have some very deep held feelings about this topic.
Well, thank you. It was great to meet you, and great to